Hey, hello, welcome, and welcome back to Arma Metro Annual Conference, Confirmed 2021. This is a session titled, How Does M365 Change the Records Management Game? What You Need to Know. Our sponsor for this session is ActiveNav. They're data privacy and governance software provider and innovator of data mapping as a service. With ActiveNav, organizations can map, clean, classify, quarantine, and delete sensitive, redundant, obsolete, trivial data. That's ROT for those of us in the industry. Hundreds of leading companies and government agencies trust ActiveNav to help them control sensitive data and support compliance with various data privacy regulations, such as CCPA and the GDPR. Our speakers for this session are John Mancini and Atla Sheklin. John is a leading and well-known information management visionary with a unique ability to connect business objectives with critical success factors for information management requirements. He's a past president of AIM and a frequent speaker and author on more than 30 ebooks and on a variety of topics. John's specialties include, but are not limited to, consensus building with executive leadership to create strategic focus, action, and accountability. Atla is president at the Digital Value Institute. He's also an information innovator and educator. Atla led AIM's information management think tank in EMEA and North America, also served as the general secretary of the DLM Forum for the European Commission, which is responsible for creating standards for electronic records management and digital archiving. He developed and delivered custom information management programs for businesses such as Chevron, European Central Bank, Konica, Minolta, and Oracle. Since the introduction of Microsoft Office 365 retention and sensitivity labels, he has specialized in integration with other Microsoft products to automate information governance and protection for global enterprises. I'm going to hand off to Atla, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, and really looking forward to sharing our lessons learned with you all. There are questions, you can submit that, but I think I'm missing my colleague, John Mancini. So hopefully he gets here soon, so he can also help out with questions. And so perhaps a little bit more on the introductions. So I work with Infotection, and Infotection is a vendor-independent consulting firm specializing in information management and records management. We have offices in the US, UK, Netherlands, and Norway. We, don't sell any software. It's all really about maximizing what you got, but it's an awful lot starting with using the Microsoft Cloud and how can we better manage, protect information in 365, Azure, and also beyond that. So the services we provide is first of all starting with the strategy. Strategy leads to blueprint. Blueprint can be everything from including taxonomies, metadata, security, search, records management, and then also supporting the business. Okay, how do we use this platform to then build or buy solutions to meet specific business needs on top of that? That could be physical records management, case management, so building upon the 365 platform. But again, we're not selling software, we're not selling licenses, it's really trying to maximize what you got. So we thought we break this session into two. The first is to share just some industry research and then share some lessons learned about managing information and records in 365. What is possible, what's the best approach based on lessons learned from some of our large customers. So starting then with just the big picture. And the big picture, John was, I prepared some slides here, but I'll try to do my best explaining his story. And that's from this industry report from AIM that looked at the 365 and SharePoint. What does that mean? What's the impact? What's the priorities? And you can see there on the screen, that's a link if you want to get access to the full report. Not going to go into detail, but just want to share some, key findings from the report. One is that 365 has become quite a common, quite known in organization. You see the biggest gray chart there is I'm broadly familiar with how Microsoft 365 is used within our organization, 83%. And there's quite a small group that doesn't actually in some way or form use Microsoft 365 or Office 365 as we used to call it. When you then look at what's the, how to say, stage and what's the awareness, is that especially due to COVID, we see that Teams especially has been, how to say, explosive growth of Teams within an organization. I don't think there's any news here, but having been in the industry, in information management industry for years, it's interesting how history repeats itself. We have a sprawl of SharePoint sites, and now we have a sprawl of Teams with connecting SharePoint sites. And especially now, the last year, that growth has been exponential. If you look at then what is how to manage that information and what do we need? At Microsoft, continue to expand this 365 features. What are views on third-party solution? Where should we use third-party solution? Is this platform good enough as it is? And the first question, what's the use of third parties? 36% say continue to greatly enhance standard functionality. And which areas you see the use of third-party solution? Governance and records management, but also integration with process specific to our industry or back-end process like HR and finance. I'll come back to that a little bit later, because we learned that third-party solutions, some places has a lot of value, other places is actually create a long-term risk and an additional cost for you. So how you look at third-party and perhaps also the requirement for third-party is key when planning your environment. We also see that if you look at, AIM asks people, how would you rate organization effectiveness in addressing the following? Know your data, protect your data, prevent data loss, and govern your data. And you see, I don't know what is it, blue teal, and the business is basically on a scale from up to 4, quite okay, and saying, yes, we know our data, we can protect our data, we can prevent data loss. IT, the gray, also quite optimistic, while many of people on this at this event that really knows information and records management, you are like, there's not really sure. And that's what we'll try to address a little bit and share. What are the ways you can best manage the information? So I'm going to jump into the last just recommendation and then start on the lessons learned. AIM had a review panel that looked at the research and came with recommendations. First, the recommendation was this challenge of remote workers. It's also an opportunity about why information management matters, because it's ensuring that people can find information they need, trust information, and also protect that information. But to do that well, you need the architecture. You need a plan, a framework, a blueprint to ensure that the different pieces fit together to actually manage and protect information. And also the third-party solution. How does a third-party solution enhance 365, but it does not actually create a problem because you're bypassing the innovation that has come from Microsoft and also that's coming. And I'll come to that in another slide. And that ensure that perhaps we learn from the past mistakes and try to get ahead, even though the Teams explosion has already happened, but there are ways of addressing that with the governance. So let me therefore go into then the main section here, which is then, okay, what does this mean for organizations? And what are the lessons learned by the early adopters for managing information and records management in 365? And let's start again on the big picture. Because in the past, especially in a large enterprise, you ended up with a lot of content silos. You had, for example, SharePoint on-premise. Some of you perhaps connected that with some sort of corporate records management, electronic records management solution to manage records coming from SharePoint and Office apps. Of course, then you have network shared drive, file service being used for everything from personal photos to data. You had perhaps an ERP system that needed a place to store files, or different line of business application that needed to store files. and that needed their own repository. So therefore, ensuring search, ensuring compliance, ensuring security across this was a challenge, and still is a challenge in my organization. While cloud platforms basically enables you, it's an opportunity to change that game. So that means that if I can have information managed and protected in that platform with the security compliance control, can I then actually build or buy third-party apps that enhances the functionality on top of it? That means basically that Microsoft is not like the answer to any question or anything like that. No, it's the foundation, it's the baseline that you actually then, which enables the business to safely buy and build apps on top of it. The challenge with third-party apps sometimes, if you put apps below that platform, because then sometimes, yes, it makes sense, but that also means often that you're bypassing some of the security compliance controls that is available now, but also is coming. And of course, Azure is on the side, because there are a lot of files, for example, on network share drives that shouldn't go into 365 or SharePoint. It should probably more live in Azure based on the use and what type of information. So if this is the big picture and the transitioning we see amongst many of our large customers with the move to cloud, it's basically trying to get rid of these silos. And that means that the sites and teams you see today in 365, think of those just as virtual containers, but they will search and access set right, metadata and access set right. So that means you can search and find information across the tenant, your environment. And how do they manage that information on the lower part? So let's dig into that. We can start with perhaps what we discussed earlier on, Teams. Because Teams is a complex product. And what you just as an example, it means that if you're chatting with somebody, that actually goes into a personal mailbox. If you're still sharing a file in a personal chat, that goes into the OneDrive. If you're in a channel and storing a file, then it goes to the SharePoint Online site that's connected, and the chat goes into the group mailbox. And therefore, managing this with a third-party solution, that is complex. And I know, therefore, some organizations have said, oh, let's not do records management in Teams. We have to tell the user instead, please store it in this other place instead. But there are opportunities with the compliance and security features to actually do records management and information governance across here. And just before going into those details, I want to share some examples of some of our large clients we worked with. One is a company that Microsoft just published a case study about, that basically started the journey, as it also explains in the case study, by basically realizing that, okay, we have 365 where work happens. How do you manage information and records being created or received in 365? So they did proof of concept with multiple vendors and came to a conclusion, perhaps the team is an example, the previous slide is an example of that. We need to leverage the 365. And why? Because it was the most integrated and also the ease of use from a user perspective. So that's one. So they now standardized for more than a year and rolled out this for records management in 365 using Microsoft's own stuff for 37,000 users around the world. But again, that's just one example. Another one, it's Shell. They actually were quite early. They were one of the design partners that built this new records management framework in 365. So Microsoft had 2-3 design partners that basically said, this is what we need, can you help us? And that was part of then evolving that functionality. And they're now been live for several years, meaning 365 is basically the standard for both collaboration, but also for records management for over 100,000 users. So it's like, okay, so why? So let's then go into the details here, the lessons learned from these and other organizations of how do you then manage information and records well in the 365 platform. Because again, like these examples, these are highly regulated companies. And let's start on perhaps what many of you already realized, that you have to start not looking at the technologies, but more your frameworks. Frameworks meaning that is your records management program really future-proof or at least ready for the digital age? And I put up 7 lessons learned here on this slide, and I wanted to spend some little bit time on that. The first is that you need to centralize the governance. If you think of it, a business will have so many different needs, but you're going to standardize it or implement it in one platform. It doesn't matter if it's 365 or SAP, but you want to implement it well, manage it well in one technology as much as possible, even though it will be many. And therefore, you want to standardize things as best as possible. So the business might give input on the value of information over time, but especially for regulatory compliance, have a central team that manages that with regular review. Second is the compliance by design is easier said than done, but can we automate the compliance based on past history, role, content, storage, location, metadata? I'll come back to that. The big buckets you already know everything about, but it's still something we face almost weekly of organization has these hundreds, if not thousands, of schedules and say, how do we implement this? And I think it's a technology issue, but it's not. And four, your corporate requirement. Your corporate requirement should cover your toughest local requirement. Of course, there are opportunities, and 365 can meet any of these, like many other systems, but do you really need to implement it? For example, that if retention for financial information is 7 years one place and 10 years another, set the corporate requirements on the tougher requirements, like 10 years as a minimum retention requirement. Or if the retention requirements is for sensitive information about personnel in Europe is you need to get rid of it a certain number of years after a lead organization, set that as the corporate requirement. And that means it because it's just easier to implement in any type of technologies and it's easier to monitor. Number 5, disposition reviews. Latest 2 days ago, I had a meeting with the senior legal counsel about that topic because people are like, oh, no, we need to have a manual review at the end of retention schedule to see if we can this should be deleted or not. But our big customers have found out that that's not scalable in the digital world. Just as an example, if 10% disposition reviews is required, meaning 10% of 10 million records is required, and each review with different people involved can take, say, 15 minutes, that's 31,000 days you have to spend on disposition reviews. Of course, you can perhaps trim this down, improve the process even more, but you're still talking about an effort. And some of our large customers also realized, and people doing this, they won't really have the knowledge, the insight to make an educated decision in 10 years, 20 years based on lessons learned. 6 is event-based retention. Event-based retention is easier in the paper world, in the electronic world. Yes, you can do it in 365 and a lot of other platforms, but you really want to because it requires, one, a unique identifier. So, for example, that this is this installation where retention should be end of life of installation plus X years, or this is for this employee HR files and retention should be as long as they work there plus Y number of years. Instead, it's trying to minimize those because it's reducing the need for adding more unique identifier, but also to manage those triggers. And it's usually an easiest way to minimize it is to look at the average information lifecycle. There are job applications, usually valid perhaps for 6 months, and then perhaps, especially with GDPR, auto deletion after, say, 12 months after they were created. And lastly, it's, of course, like many of you already been preaching for years, is that it's not only records that should have a life cycle, also non-records. So some of our big customers are now implementing this. For example, that if a file has not been declared as a record and has been not modified in the last 3 years, then auto-delete. It also creates an incentive for people to ensure that information that should be declared as record are declared as records. So that's the framework. And often when we talk to customers and a new client, they think it's a technology challenge to have in front of them or technology program, but often they have to start with the information and records management program. Is it digital ready? So, but let's still go in and talk a little bit on what does this mean from a technology perspective. And starting with perhaps the key thing here, and that is establish an architecture for automation of governance and records management. And usually this includes the following 6 components. And what we mean by that is it's a framework, it's a blueprint of how the different pieces fits together. So it's not like, oh, today let's start thinking about record label and start testing that. it's looking at this together with other requirements that you need to do and the technology to support it. And that way you also get aligned implementation of the different Microsoft technologies you have, like sensitivity labels and record labels. So the key components here, and you can start from information architecture and information enrichment, is that the ways where you can automate the enrichment using metadata of content being stored. Often that means in the beginning of the information lifecycle, so that when you create the teams or a site, that you actually then get, and you set some, for example, default metadata on it, you set other sharing security controls on it, and any files you stored on that automatically inherit those, and it's protected by those. And there's also techniques on the ensuring privacy and compliance, but here we'll focus with more deep dive into the records management part in a couple of slides. And legal discovery, of course, is to streamline this, either just using the core e-discovery part of E3 or the more advanced with more artificial intelligence processing, custodian management in the advanced e-discovery. So let me break those down in a little bit more detail. And we can start on the first two, and then we'll go into more the records management side. And the first two is, I said that, can you apply some governance in the beginning of the life cycle? One way to do that is some sort of Teams provisioning and templates engine. Same with SharePoint site. And of course, many third-party providers do that, but it's also free templates available in places like GitHub. And the example you see on the screen here is basically taking one of the free templates that actually Microsoft had published to GitHub, and then basically modifying that to create custom templates for Teams. And it means that depending on which template they choose, that this is a project, this is an HR site or Teams, then you automatically apply naming conventions, security, taxonomy, and compliance controls. So that depending on what they have built-in security. And an important part of that when we talk about taxonomy is perhaps default metadata. So that you have default metadata on the storage container where files are being stored in SharePoint Online, and any file stored on that Teams or via that Teams on that site automatically inherit those default metadata. And that basically means, why do we care about that? Because that means search, automated governance can then rely on those metadata. And means that in one tenant, for example, a global Microsoft 365 tenant, you go in and say, I want to look for information in this country or this process or this function or this type based on those default metadata on the container or file stored. And of course, we know that, hey, but this Teams is already out there. And one of our customers actually had 28,000 teams and sites set up before governance program started. But then there's scripts another way to actually then get governance and that structure and the same controls on those teams and sites that's already been set up. And and I'll come back to it in a little bit later, is another opportunity when using this type of teams and template provisioning and templates, is that if you have big bucket categories, that you then set that category, for example, financial information, or it's some sort of business operation information, and you set that as a default metadata value on the storage container. And what that allows you, and for records management, is that you can automate records management based on the document lifecycle. So, for example, if a file is then turned into final, either stored at final place, or a user manually change the document status to final, automatically declare it as a record, based on the big bucket category set on the storage container as default metadata. I'll come back to that also a little bit later. So that's on the start of the journey, and that means that you then set default of the metadata and other controls on the storage container. But of course, there's also ways of enriching things in addition to that. And this might look like a very complex slide, but it basically shows the auto-classification ecosystem in 365, also supported by Azure. And there are some different colors here. So you have sensitive information types, which is already 150 different types built into even the E3 license of 365. So you can automate GDPR information, driving license identification, passport, stuff like that. Then you have trainable classifiers, but then you need one of the E5 add-on modules, which is actually machine learning. So you go out and say, this is how this type of record look like, and automatically identify that. And then you can apply sensitivity labels, record labels, which is a little bit different colors, but that's a different functionality, and I'll come back to that. Quite new, you have also syntax, but again, that's another add-on, which is now in the first version, that allows you to do auto-classification and auto-extractions, meaning classify the information and automate metadata extraction. So some of the main perhaps common tools in 365 to better automate the understanding of information. But we're working with a couple of clients now to actually say, yes, but we want to take it to the next level. And then for the important libraries, sending that information to Azure with text cognitive services, text analytics, to basically extract metadata, keywords, language, and so on, to basically have even better auto-classification. And of course, that information can also then be returned back to 365 in those libraries with more enriched metadata. You can actually also connect this with other Azure databases and systems. So for example, if I find an agreement ID in a document, okay, I do a lookup in a database and say, what do I know about this agreement ID? Extract all the additional information there, and also return that as metadata to manage the information, which then in return improves search and the governance policies. The retention label here, of course, it's a key area for records management, which I think many of you know. So let's dig into that one in a little bit more detail. This is basically a retention label, but the retention labels can be used as record labels, or just in the last few months, also as a regulatory record label. So what's the difference? A retention label is basically just managing the life cycle. People continue working, but it's managing the retention of that file. For records management, we are either using the retention label as a record label or as a regulatory record label. And so the second or third column here, record label locked, record label unlocked, that's a functionality that allows you basically to unlock a record. And that hurts. Don't get upset there. It just means I can use that record, make basically a copy of it with an audit trail. That's what means unlocking it. I can make the changes to it and then lock it again. But again, it's actually a new record, and it's an audit trail between the two. And the first one there's no impact on its integrity, and it actually continues with the original retention set on that. But it's a very useful functionality when you have governance documents, standard operating procedures, where people using perhaps hyperlinks, or they want to ensure that people always find the latest version. And that's where this use lock unlock. But if you see the difference between a record label locked and a regulatory record label, a regulatory record label is perhaps even stricter controls. For example, a record label, a file that's been declared with a record label, you can still change the metadata of that file, and you can actually also move it completely around in your tenant. The file is there, protected, can't be edited, can't be deleted. While a record label is much more limitation of what you can do. A regulatory record label. A regulatory record label is really there to meet some of the demands for real warm compliance, if people remember that term, especially for perhaps SAC, which you could meet with also record label, but then you have to more limit the access and rights on sites which had record labels. Now you can do that much more out of the box using the regulatory record label instead. But for most areas we work with the large organization, record label is the standard, and the regulatory record labels are used some areas where this is required. So that's the type of labels. But again, each of those record label has a number of functionality linked to it. And this is a complex slide, but let me just talk through it. First part is, how does a label be applied? It can be manually applied by a user, or it can be set as default on a library or folder or it can be automatically applied using content, metadata, machine learning, and so on, the things we talked about. It can also be automatically applied during migration. And we often see customers or organizations starting manual labeling, meaning that we're telling users, please remember to think carefully if this should be declared as a record and then apply the appropriate label. And often it means if you're a large organization, you have to only publish relevant label to a site to ensure you don't get label overload. But we think more and more that that's not the future-proof way of doing it. It's actually much more flexible, much more future-ready to actually auto-apply label using metadata and machine learning. It's more because looking at some of the technologies and way opportunities I shared in the previous slide about auto-classification, metadata extraction, it's having a framework here, even for records management, that allows you to build and leverage that innovation, that race that's happening with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that's why metadata-driven is auto labels or metadata. Using metadata to auto-apply record labels is more and more what we work in organization. And remember also that a label, of course, has a name. Often the name will be what it is. It's a classification of it. It could be a description of users, even though if you use auto-apply based on metadata, you don't actually then publish it for the users. So users, you don't really need a description. You need a description for admins. The retention could be will have a period, a trigger. Trigger can be date either created, modified, label applied. Label applied is usually the most common. If you do event-based retention, even though I warned you about it, you can do that here with the event instance. We actually, with one customer, even integrated with SAP. So events are automatically created when people leave in the SAP system. Disposition can be automatic deletion, disposition review or nothing, or you can customize it. For example, if you have a transfer to a state archive, a national archive. And of course, you can also use the file plan functionality in here or a third-party solution for this. So that's some of the functionality in it, and it supports all those things we talked about earlier on, except should you really do event-based retention all around place? Should you really do disposition review for every single record? That's more a policy decision before you start configuring this. Last few things. One is that so far we talked about 365, but some of these opportunities you can also use when migrating to 365 in this move to the cloud. For example, I mentioned sensitive information types that include something called regular expression or keyword or other techniques to identify patterns and terms inside files to automatically apply, for example, a record label. It can also be a classifier assistant. That's the machine learning I mentioned earlier on to actually auto-apply. So basically, if you have a lot of files and they're not governed well, but you know there are records, there are gold inside that big volume, there's some needles in the haystack, you can move them in to perhaps some temporary sites or perhaps even long-term sites, and then use some of these techniques to automatically identify and classify records from those third-party systems. So that's we see more and more because it basically is a way to speed up things and ensuring that important information, the records, are identified and captured, even though it requires some resources and work depending on the variety and the multitude of records you have. If you want to do it even more advanced, some of the things I talked about earlier about Azure Cognitive Services, we have actually a couple of projects now just kicking off that actually say, can I use Azure Pipeline to do a fast and smart transformation and migration? So for example, network file shares. Take those files, do a quick inventory, then use Azure Databox, move it into Azure, and then use the Azure technologies available to process that. It could be metadata analysis, it could be sensitive information identification, it could be cognitive processing. And then based on the sample, you create decision categories to say, this information should be deleted, it shouldn't be moved over, there could be 25% of it. This information should go to 365 and SharePoint site. Well, this information doesn't even belong in SharePoint, it should be in Azure file shares. And basically using some of these techniques that, or the tools you have in the tool set to automate or to help you in this transition to the cloud. And again, the benefit of some of these things we talked about earlier on is that the same framework with metadata, the same framework with record labels, sensitivity labels, can then be used also for the information that's been migrated. And you can build apps on top of it, for example, for physical records management, like one of our big customers done. So it's the same search experience, it's the same actually managing retention. It's just that now you're being told when you get some of the hits, or you need to order this record from, for example, Iron Mountain. So I know this has been a lot of information in a short run. I hope there's some questions we can jump to. Couple of things just at the end. One, I talked about this already, but I just want to show how search can then look like. This is basically out-of-the-box search. It's just that the metadata has been mapped in the search administration so that you have those default metadata or those things that have been auto-classified showing up as metadata filters. So if I do a search there, do a search, basic search for documents, I can filter that down, and for every time I click, it will narrow things down to help me find specific those information, documents or records I'm looking for. Or I can go to advanced search and actually search specifically on the available metadata. And again, this is just SharePoint search, which basically there's no real customization here. It's just a mapping to make that possible to show up for users. So last two things here. One is feel free to ping us if you want to follow up in more deep dive discussions, anything we can help with. We've been doing this for a while, as you also heard in the introductions. We've found that based on lessons learned by some of the large customers, we can step and repeat the journey much more faster. We also know what works, what doesn't work. So we actually a design partner with Microsoft also for improving these compliance offerings. And just perhaps to end with just an example of how a typical project look like to explore this. Is something like this, that you have the blueprint, which is 8 weeks, which it starts with business workshops. And basically, we use templates. So we stopped asking you people, what metadata do you need and stuff like that. Instead, we come with a recommendation. There's a discussion around that. And then we use a demo to show what does this mean for users? What does it mean for admins? Then based on that, configuring some proof of concept, run that, to basically test and feel both the user experience, the admin experience, and it is a sign-off on that. Then it's basically planning, okay, how would we roll this out carefully, starting with business pilots, and then to validate that this is signed correct. So you see here, this is not long-term consulting stuff. It's basically, I would say, trying to do this as simple as possible based on lessons learned. So, that's the end.
I'm here.
Hey!
My apologies. I know you always thought that I talked too long in my introduction, but I didn't know that you would ever go so far as to remotely crash my entire system and, to keep me silent. But I so apologize. That's never happened to me before, with everything going haywire all at the same time. So I thought maybe I would help you with some questions. How about that?
Yes, please.
Okay. Question popped up in the chat, which I thought was interesting, is that they talked about the rapid deployment of Teams in a COVID environment, and a lot of people raising their hands to say, hey, wait a minute, we haven't really thought about this. We're going too fast, and basically the C-suite overriding them, and now they have just a complete mess. What should they do now? Now that the cow's out of the barn, or whatever that phrase is.
So first of all, as information managers, we can't stop this. We have to just, address it. And I think, John, you've been saying many times when I used to work for you, with every challenge, there comes opportunities. and usually most of the clients we work with, the cat is already out of the bag. Sorry, we have two cats here. But so it usually the recommendation is to do the following. One, start by getting a governance structure in place so that any new teams and site is created has the appropriate governance. So that would be step one.
Stop the bleeding.
Stop the bleeding, yeah. Once you stop the bleeding, you have that control. Then look at how do I then retrofit the same governance on the teams and site that's already out there. And sometimes that can be done just with basic scripts and other ways to run in the tenant to set that governance, retrofit that on those teams as already created. One of our customers had 28,000, I think I mentioned it earlier on, 28,000 teams and sites that all been set up without governance. And so because the goal should be we have governance at all. I've given up the idea that some sites or teams should not have governance, others should have governance, because it just creates complexities. It's better to have a minimum set of governance on all, and that means stop the bleed, get the governance in place for any new stuff. Then second step, address the things you already have. And then also that's when you really should start planning migrations, because then you're migrating to a future-proof, or as best as possible, future-ready architecture and governance that you can then also get the migrated information over on.
How about the question about how you think through the issue of managing in place versus consolidation in M365?
So is it Winnie the Pooh that says both, please? So what I mean by that is it really depends on the life cycle of your teams and sites. If like energy sector, had some example for energy sector. An energy sector can often have sometimes 2-3 different types of teams. You have some teams that are for organization units, like HR, like IT, like finance. And those are long-term teams and sites. And there, sometimes it makes sense, depending on the size of the organization, to have information managed in place, together with where information is being used by the people working there, with the supporting documents nearby it, in context with the records. Other times we see organizations, especially the large one, they say in finance department, no, we're going to standardize on one site for certain processes. And then it becomes more a centralized records management, but it's just one of many centralized. If you in energy sector, you often have also asset sites, which are like the key business entities, which are also very, very long-term. And often, again, sometimes that information, the records is managed in place where they're being used. Other times, over time, you see a centralization. And the record labels I mentioned earlier on, they support that move over time. And while the third type of teams you often find is project teams. And project teams are often, there's a start and the end, even though sometimes we don't really know the end. And therefore, those places, it's more, then you have a life cycle around it and a process, and you can actually automate that quite well also, that ensure that the records that's been created in that teams is moved over to a more long-term teams and site, or perhaps even is centralized. But so to answer your question, it's usually a combination of in-place versus centralized, but it's in most cases, it's not one central place. It's many, depending on functions or the purpose.
One thing that our colleague Brian Tumler and I have talked about, and it might be fanciful, and I'd be interested in whether you think it's fanciful or not, is, we've spent years in the content management and records management space talking about how great it would be to have everybody on a single platform and be able to have everybody doing, not going off to a WebEx client to do video conferencing, or going off to a chat client to do something else, or going off to a document sharing client to do something else. So now we have this Teams explosion, gone from order of magnitude increase in average daily users in the course of a year. It has all those functionalities in it. Have we started to approach a point where we can turn that lemon of rapid diffusion into lemonade of having everybody on a common platform, or will those pesky users just keep frustrating us at every call?
I see the large organization, some of our large customers, they are almost there. Many of them actually, to some extent, are there, depending on what area, because think of it also, and it was one of the first slides I did after covering John's slide, is that if you look at this more as the platform, the foundation, that basically means that you can use this platform as a secure and compliant platform for innovation. You can allow the business to build or buy things as long as they meet certain requirements, and it's app layers on top of it. So you can then do citizen development with workflows. You can do case management. You can do whatever it is, and actually even open up the business to do things as long as it's application layer and not creating another silos. So I think, and that means that, but it also means that governance you have in the platform, you need to think and get the architecture right, because you need to ensure that you have standardized controls across. That could be metadata, it could be access control, it could be information protection, to ensure that the information is protected well, and are there areas that need additional protection, then you add that on top of it.
How about the question of maybe one or two more? The question of third-party solutions in an environment in which things are changing rapidly on the cloud. You know, my personal opinion, and I've seen it in some research that I've done, is that there's still a role for third-party solutions, but you have to look at this a lot more carefully than you once did. What are your thoughts on that?
Our recommendation is usually that you have to make some platform strategic decisions. And if the platform is then, I would say, the foundation. And you also have to look at what innovation exchanges do you expect, because it will just happen faster and faster. And therefore, I think I said it earlier on also, is that applications on the enhanced, third-party, the enhanced 365, yes. There's a need for it. Sometimes you can build it, sometimes you should buy it. But I would be very careful on things that bypass the platform security and compliance control. So, for example, if I'm going to manage my physical records, then in a perfect world, and we see some of our large customers now doing this, I would then use the platform and extend the platform with the application layer to manage my physical record. I won't buy a separate solution that sits beside it and then work to try to get the search to work across. Instead, it's again application layer, not repositories or systems that actually bypass some of the security compliance control, if based on the strategic choice of the platforms for the future.
There's a question I'd like to pose out to the audience, and maybe people could chime in or chime in with us directly. You can contact me at john.m@infotection.com or atla.s@infotection.com. And the question is this: I'm interested about other people are experiencing this. We were talking to a client yesterday, and they talked a little bit about the fact that they were driving towards a much more comprehensive retention implementation and disposition implementation than they've ever had before. And the driver for it was a report that Gartner did focused on retention risks in an audit environment. And so who wound up, driving this was the audit committee, worried about unnecessary retention of data and information, which then has triggered a whole slew of things that are positive to people like us that care about this. And I'm just curious, and if anybody has had similar experience, that coming from finance and audit is not usually, we're used to legal, we're used to process people, but finance and audit, if anybody else has had that experience, I'd be interested in hearing about it, because I think that was really a terrific driver in this particular company. And they're looking now at trying to consolidate 150 different systems that they have out there.
So I know we're on overtime, John. Can I just say one last thing?
Yeah.
As a recommendation to people on attending here? Don't lose yourself in Microsoft license discussions. What I mean by that is,
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
If you are on the E3 license, then maximize the governance on the E3 license. A lot of the things I talked about here, you can actually do on the E3 license, but you can't do records management. But don't let that stop you. Get the governance right with what we else talk about if you have the E3 license. And the business case for perhaps buying some of the add-on licenses, you can look at what's the opportunities for cost savings or reducing risk by replacing legacy systems. As one example, we had a client that was paying more per year for a legacy ECM system for 1,500 users than the records management add-on license for 30,000 users. So it's don't say that, oh, this is going to be too expensive. Yes, the E5 license is expensive. It includes a lot, But if you want to do records management, there are multiple, how to say, smaller bundles you can use instead. For example, the E5 information protection and governance license that has the machine learning, it has the records management, it has the event-based retention, the lock unlock, and some of the other functionality. And that's a much smaller. But again, are you on the E3? Start with E3.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice to close on. You know, one of the things that I've often tried to emphasize with people, and it's hard because when you get in sessions like this, everybody always assumes that everybody's at the same starting point. But the reality is that you have to start where you start, and there's no point in going at this more comprehensively than that. And so, if you have E3, maximize E3, maximize what you're doing within E3. Look at possibly some of those add-ons that you can do as a bridge to E5. Don't necessarily assume that you have to go to E5 immediately, even though I know the sales pressure of vendors will be to go to E5 immediately. But get the basics under control with what you have first before you make things even more complex than what you already have. So I want to thank everybody again. Apologize for my technical difficulties. I know that Atla probably did better on my slides than he could. I've known him a long time, and he certainly probably handled them more expeditiously than I would, and so I appreciate that. And again, if we can help, you know, one of the reasons why I'm so intrigued with what Infotection is doing is that I think we're at a really interesting inflection point with M365 right now. You know, I know people have talked about records management within the SharePoint environment for a long time, and there's been a lot of bells and whistles that didn't quite really work the way people thought. But there's an awful lot of interesting things going on now with M365 and automating governance and providing a platform to ride over time. And so if we can help you with that and help you think through how you marry your information strategy, your business strategy, you know, let us know. Outlet.s@infotection.com and john.m@infotection.com. So thank you guys very much.
Hey, I just want to thank both of you. Thank you, Outlet. Thank you, John. That was excellent. I want to thank the audience, our attendees, and all the participation and questions are really appreciated. All right.
Steve, one thing, if you could send us the comment string, I noticed that we couldn't comment on the comment string.
Yeah.
But there were some questions embedded in there that we didn't get to, and I'd love to follow up with those people.
Okay, I think, yeah, we can pull them.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.